Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
Can we get serious now?
One thing that did happen during the 60s was some music of an unusual or experimental nature did get recorded and did get released. Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right. We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives who are making the decisions of what people should see and hear in the marketplace.
Success in the music business begins with a dream, a vision. This podcast will give you, the listener, the insight and tools to turn that vision into a reality. Meet the industry professionals who work day by day behind the scenes, helping to make those dreams come true. Welcome to the business side of music.
On the show with us today, Daniel Weisman. Prior to joining Alliance Bernstein in 2019, Dan spent over a decade as an entrepreneur and trusted advisor in the music industry. Prior to joining Alliance Bernstein in 2019, Dan spent over a decade as an entrepreneur and trusted advisor in the music industry. Most recently as an executive artist manager at Rock Nation and managed top artists including Wale, Big Sean, Mike Posner, and Capital Cities. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Glad you could be here. So, the big thing that we're all hearing about these days on the news, anybody that works in the industry, is everybody selling their songwriting catalog. And I guess maybe everyone is much of a broad stroke of the brush, but everybody from Bob Dylan to Neil Young, Imagine Dragons, and Stevie Nicks. Why is this taking place all of a sudden, it seems like, although I guess it has been going on for years, but now it's in the headlines?
I think that there's two factors intersecting right now in the world. One is low interest rates, and two is the wider adoption of streaming. So those two things combined have made it a lot easier for people to predict, future revenues from music. Whereas if you look back 15 years ago, when piracy was destroying the music business, there was no way to predict what a song would be worth in a couple of years, whereas now it's much easier to do. And then you combine that with the low interest rate environment we're in, basically historically low interest rates, and investors are looking for yield wherever they can find it, and specifically yield that's not correlated to the rest of the economy. So music flourishes both in up times and down times. So you have big institutional money coming in and buying stuff like music rights because their bonds or fixed income strategies are not yielding what they used to be. And so, you buy a catalog and you're paying a 13 or 14 times multiple. It's essentially like a 7 or 8% annual return on the investment. So those two factors coming together have made this fertile ground for acquiring music rights.
Is this something that's just really transpired recently? I think I read somewhere a while back that the Beatles and Michael Jackson, they went through some of the same thing where their catalogs were sold. Is it just more of a lucrative time now? Once again, I'm just trying to figure out why all of a sudden, why are so many selling their catalogs?
Well, if you think back to the Michael Jackson Beatles deal in the 80s, interest rates were actually at historical highs at that time. So that was a more nuanced deal where somebody like Michael Jackson, who at the time was probably the wealthiest person in the entertainment business, certainly the music business, had been told by Paul McCartney himself how valuable publishing was. And when he found that the Beatles, or a lot of the Beatles writer's share, it was the publisher share, I believe, came on the market, he said, well, I got all this money, Paul McCartney told me this is worth something. I should probably buy it. Prior to that, though, the Beatles had sold some of their shares in order to have a capital gains event. And, people look back on that and say, oh, they must have made a mistake. But the reality is that if Michael Jackson had put the money that he spent on the Beatles catalog into an S&P 500 index fund back in 1986 or whenever he bought it, he actually would have more money than he made off the sale. What it's not factoring in is the, any sort of distributions or revenue share that he might have gotten from his deal with Sony ATV. But it was a great move for him, but it wasn't like this massive steal or anything like that. So fast forward a number of years and you have, piracy taking over the music business in the late 90s and early aughts. nobody thought that music was going to have any sort of real long-term, call it enterprise value. Prior to that point, there were evergreen hits that did well on radio and, would never go away. But, more contemporary stuff would have a very steep decline in terms of how well it would do, whether it was CD singles or albums or further down the line, digital singles. And there was no long tail value in acquiring music rights. Spotify and Apple Music and streaming has changed that, because the barrier to listening to music is essentially non-existent at this point. And because of playlists, you have the long tail of a song existing far longer into the future than it ever has before, because people are constantly revisiting those songs the same way they would have done it on their iPod. The difference is they're getting paid for it every single time, as opposed to having that one-time 99-cent event that would last maybe 8 weeks and then sort of trail off into the sunset.
Someone along the lines of like Bob Dylan, who sold his catalog for, I think it was $300 to $400 million. He's basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's basically given up the rights to that music to whoever's purchased it. He's just
Correct.
walking away with a check, just kind of wiping his hands of the deal. Are these smart moves long-term? Now, Dylan would probably maybe be, he's a legend. He's been around for decades. His career path is probably coming to its tail end, at least from a touring live performance perspective. Does it make sense for the young artists to be doing this in the same way that the old artists are doing it? And I should preface that by saying is, how deep does that catalog need to be in order for it to become something viable that these investors are going to be looking at?
I mean, as long as something is generating income perennially, there's certainly a buyer for it. I think that when you have, let's say, one hit record out of maybe a dozen total, right, then you're not going to get as much money, because people are going to look at that and say, well, this is the overwhelming majority of the royalties that we would be buying into, and what if this song doesn't behave the way we think it will and trails off into the sunset? Then we're kind of like, up, Schitt's Creek without a paddle.
Right.
So, people are looking for diversification. Having one massive hit peppered in with a number of other, not as big hits can be both a gift and a curse. But back to your question about Bob Dylan, the funny thing is that he went about his business, very, very intelligently his entire career, owning as much of his stuff as he possibly could. Not only that, publishing other people as well. And, to me, him selling is really the ultimate form of agency, and the ultimate sort of fuck you to the system of like, hey, I built up all this value and now I'm going to sell it to Universal Music Publishing. Not only that, he avoids the pitfalls of so many other musicians, like Prince, for instance, who didn't get their estate in order before they had passed. And he can say, okay, I have $500 million, and I can divide that evenly between my kids and whoever else. Whereas when you're leaving a bunch of intellectual property, it makes it much more difficult to divide that up. So to me, this is like him cleaning up, him controlling his own destiny, and not having his kids go off and sell it for whatever price they think was right.
Right. So what is the smart way to start selling your catalog that you own? Is there cookie cutter template, or is there a formula for doing this the right way, the smart way?
Sure. Well, I would first say that if you need to sell your catalog, don't sell your catalog. The people that should sell are the ones that don't need to sell, the ones that can make a measured, calculated decision on what is best for them and their family, and then have a plan on how to deploy that capital after the sale. Too often people sell stuff when they need to, and when they need to sell something, generally they'll take a worse deal than if they don't need to sell it. So that's kind of my first piece of advice. Beyond that, most artists that I come in contact with have never audited their publishing company or record label. And in virtually every single publishing and recording contract, there is a clause that allows you a look back period to audit the royalties on your publishing or record deal. But every 6 months that passes, that first 6-month window from whatever that look back period is closes. And so the first thing I say, in terms of the process is go and audit your publisher, put them on notice right now that you're going to be auditing them, get in line. And there's a long line, if you're going to audit your publisher and you give them a notice now, it's probably not going to happen until December of this year. Make sure you get that done, because when you sell it, if you sell it without an audit, well, the people buying it are going to go and find those royalties, and you're essentially giving them a discount. Beyond that, I would say make sure you get a proper valuation done, maybe even get 2 valuations done. But the other thing is that I'm into cars, and car appraisers are not car buyers, and catalog valuators are not catalog buyers. So the valuation is kind of arbitrary. It's really what the market will pay. The market itself is relatively inefficient because there's not, it's not publicized, it's not public. There's a lot of NDAs. A lot of people just go to like maybe a handful of people they know who are buyers, or they've read about or heard, a colleague of theirs do a deal with in the past. So making sure that your deal gets out in front of as many people as possible is super important. And also making sure that the people advising you, whether it's a manager or a business manager or an attorney, that make sure they have experience doing this, because this is not just a simple, recording contract or publishing contract or, show offer. This is a acquisition, and making sure that your ass is covered on the deal. For instance, if you want to have the ability to go back in 35 years and reclaim, get a reversion on your copyrights based on U.S. copyright law, making sure that the deal doesn't preclude you from doing that. And if it does, make sure you're getting paid for it. There's a lot of pitfalls in this kind of stuff. And, generally speaking, the people in the music business only care about accounts receivable because it's such a commission-driven business. So making sure that you have all your ducks in a row, and making sure that you have somebody that's a fiduciary that's looking out for you, I think is really of the utmost importance.
Something you said about getting the word out there that you're interested in selling your catalog, finding those people. How do you go about doing that?
Well, getting some sort of trusted advisor in the mix that has experience, that is, playing in traffic in this space, that knows buyers, and getting it in front of them, especially if you're not a known entity. I would say, generally speaking, people don't care, if somebody is famous or not, because, basically $1 of income is worth $1 of income. But making sure that there's people that are looking at the sexy deals, the ones that make it in the, in the trades and make it in the news. But then there's people that are buying stuff every day from people you've never heard of, whether that's a Christian artist or it's somebody doing music for movies or something like that. But making sure you're going to the right buyer that is interested in acquiring specifically what you're selling, and really pairing up with someone that has done this before is really the best way to go about it.
We're going to take a break, get a word in for one of our sponsors. We're going to come back, have some more conversation with Daniel Weisman.
This is Claire Ratliff with Laughing Penguin Publicity, and you're listening to the business side of music.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Hi, everyone. I'm Larry Butler, and I want to send you a free digital copy of my new book, The Singer-Songwriter Rulebook, 101 Ways to Help You Improve Your Chances of Success. That's right. Everything you need to know to launch your career as a singer-songwriter, all based on my 40 years in the live performance arena, and believe me, I've seen it all. In my book, you'll find the 10 things you have to deal with before even thinking about becoming a singer-songwriter performer. You'll also learn about the 5 things every singer-songwriter can do this weekend to make their live show better. 5 things I can guarantee that you are not doing already. Plus, there's tips on songwriting and staging, photo and video shoots, publishing, merch, dozens of other topics. All written for people who don't particularly like to read. And again, it's free. Just go to the Business Side of Music website homepage and look for my book cover. Click on it, and a free digital copy of my book will be yours. I'm Larry Butler, and I approve of this message.
As a musician, you have a dream, that vision of what success looks like for you. Though it's not only about the money, money is part of it. Whether you've been extremely successful or you're just striving to maintain a regular cash flow, you need a plan. Money Concepts can help you develop a customized plan to achieve the financial stability and success you want. For over 40 years, Money Concepts has been providing holistic financial planning services to individuals, families, and business owners. As an independent firm, Money Concepts and their associates are committed to always represent the best interest of the client. It's really about a committed, benevolent interest in them personally. This independence, coupled with that committed, benevolent interest, means they represent you, the client, not a product supplier. It's not about selling products, it's about helping you achieve success. To learn how this can benefit you, contact my buddy, John Adams with Money Concepts at 737-867-9309. That's 737-867-9309. You can also email John at jadams@moneyconcepts.com.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Back in the studio, Daniel Weisman is joining us today from Alliance Bernstein. We're talking about catalog sales, which has been a hot button topic here for a while. Something that has come up in some conversations in the last year or two has been borrowing against your publishing. Does that make any more sense to borrow against the songs that you own than selling it? If you had to plot a course of action, as you said, maybe just to kind of get your ducks in a row, get your affairs in order, are you better off selling your catalog, or should you look at that borrowing against it?
I mean, the reality is that a record deal and a publishing deal is essentially exactly what you described. Mm-hmm. So you get an advance, you got to pay that money back. And you pay that money in the back in the form of whatever the split you've negotiated with the record deal, the record company or the publishing company. So the thing that I find curious is that there's people that are trying to spin something that already exists into something else that you're just kind of like, okay, so you're basically you're trying to start a derivative publishing company of some kind, right? But the reality is that most publishers, and I think Cobalt was really the first one to do this, will pay out an advance on projected future royalties based on how the Cobalt deals are structured. They're simple term deals. They're not, MDRC deals like a traditional publisher like Sony or Warner Chappell. So if they see in your pipeline that you got, $100,000 of income, well, they'll advance you $75,000 or so, and it's essentially interest free. So I think getting into any sort of situation where your credit is potentially going to be affected, it's going to show up on some sort of, your balance sheet if you decide to go and get a mortgage. Any sort of, credit or lending facilities have far greater implications than taking an advance from a publisher or a record company, and making sure that you really understand what the ramifications of that are. Because I've seen even some, some distribution companies that have offered advances, but in the small print, what they don't tell you up front is that, hey, if you don't pay this back or you don't earn this back, this is going to affect your credit and we can come collect on this.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I don't want to name any names, but, making sure that you understand that, hey, a record deal might be a terrible financial decision, but it might be a better financial decision than an actual loan. Because really at the end of the day, a record deal is a forgivable loan, because if you don't recoup it back, it's not like they can come put a lien on any sort of future income or on your house or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely correct. Let's talk about Prince for a moment, because that's a perfect scenario of where things weren't put in order. Is it too late at that point to find a valuation of his music? Or is it like what you said earlier, where if you get the right people in, they can start crunching those numbers and figuring out what the true cash value of that is? Is that something that can be done once the artist, I guess maybe I'm saying, does the artist themselves bring some value to the table in addition to that music?
Well, I think that if an artist is still alive, the ability to exploit that is different. I don't know if it's better or worse. I certainly think there's a lot of artists that have done better in death than they did in life, but putting a value on intellectual property is, it's virtually impossible. There's people out there that do it, for IRS tax purposes and charitable giving purposes and whatnot. But, when you're bringing people in to do stuff like that, if it's for a charitable purpose, you're wanting to get the highest value possible. If it's for an estate planning and IRS purpose, you want to get the lowest valuation possible. Right. So again, catalog valuators are not catalog buyers. It's the market determines what something is worth. And over time, depending on what sort of time period you're looking at, will Bob Dylan's music earn $300 million Yeah, probably at some point. I don't know if that's going to be in 15 years or 30 years, right?
Right.
So, but the great thing is that it's an asset that could then be sold again. Whereas when you're dealing with like a bond or something like that, it comes to maturity and then that's it. Like you can't go and sell a bond that's come to maturity. It's not worth anything anymore. So there is some value in holding these assets, but what it's actually worth, I mean, it's really just what somebody's willing to pay for it.
Yeah, and then that brings up the question of, okay, the value of, once again, let's talk about the Bob Dylan catalog, $300-400 million. And it may take 15, 20 years, give or take, to recoup that investment. Is that something that these investors are looking at? Is it a long-term game plan for them? Are they looking for ways to capitalize on it, or are they just kind of sitting on it and hoping that it'll grow?
Well, I think everyone's got a different, MO. If you look at Universal Music Publishing, which bought Bob Dylan's catalog, their Universal Music is going public next year. So you got to think that there was some consideration related to that and their IPO, right? They're not going anywhere though, right? Universal Music Publishing is going to be Universal Music Publishing the same way it's been for the last however many years. But you look at somebody else like, Hypnosis, they're already publicly traded. So they're trying to get cash flow and they're trying to get dividends to their investors so that they could bring on, more investors. But that's a publicly traded company. Roundhill also publicly traded. But then you look at other funds that are acquiring stuff. I think a lot of them are probably, going into it hoping to hold, based on like let's say a 13 times multiple, right? It's going to take them 13 years to make their money back. And once they made their money back, they can decide, okay, we want to still collect these checks, or you know what, we want to flip this, but there's still going to be value there. I haven't heard of anyone going in to buy something and then flip it in 2 years. I have not seen that at all. I think these are longer term plays. In order to really get the money out of it, they have to be longer term plays.
And these folks are obviously they're willing to sit on it for that length of a period.
Well, I mean, it's cash flowing, it's like you go and buy a building that has a bunch of tenants and they're paying rent. I mean, people want cash flow.
We're going to take another break, get another word in for another one of our sponsors, and come back, have some more conversation with Dan Weisman.
Hey everyone, this is Jack Sharkey. I'm the Marketing and Technical Communications Manager at KEF, and you're listening to The Business Side of Music.
You're listening to The Business Side of Music.
Since 1963, Korg has been creating new experiences in music and performance. That is what drove the creation of some of Korg's most legendary products, such as the Poly 6, the M1, the Electribe, the Triton, the Minilog, the Kronos, Wave State, Op6, and most recently the Nautilus, which is what we have here in our studio. Korg is dedicated to creating new, innovative, and uncompromising instruments which maintain the highest quality to inspire music makers, past, present, and future. Visit Korg.com or your favorite Korg dealer to get your hands on one of their products and start creating new music always. Korg, the official sponsor of the business side of music.
Whether you consider yourself a musician or not, music is all around us, and it affects our everyday lives, whether it's background music influencing our shopping habits in a store, organ music adding the vibe to a baseball game, or a playlist convincing us to keep going on that last mile of a run. I'm Mindy Peterson, host of the podcast Enhanced Life with Music, where we take a holistic look at music's benefits through the lens of science and medicine, entertainment, and business. You can find me and Enhance Life with Music at mpetersonmusic.com/podcast or wherever you get your audio.
You're listening to The Business Side of Music.
Back in the studio, Dan Weisman with Alliance Bernstein is with us. We're talking about catalog sales. You brought up something that has popped up with some artists that I've worked with in the past, which is all of a sudden you find out that your accounting wasn't being handled the way it should have, and you owe a lot of money to the IRS all of a sudden. Sometimes, 6 or 7 figures. Is that a situation where you should borrow against your catalog, or should you try and cash it out and pay that off to get that albatross off your back?
Listen, I can't give tax or legal advice, but I can tell you that if it was me, the IRS is not going to come and repossess your songwriting interests.
Yeah.
Right. the end of the day, they want money. And from what I've seen in my dealings with artists that have had this issue, there's always a negotiation to be had. But if you go and sell your catalog or you go and borrow against it, and you all of a sudden get this big check into your bank account, well, they're going to want to get paid what they're owed. So I would say if you owe money, work out a deal so that you're not basically, selling yourself out. And then, at that point, your credit's probably screwed at that point. But the worst thing would be to, realize the value of your intellectual property, probably at a lower threshold than would normally happen, to then go pay off an IRS tax bill and then be left with nothing. I'd rather be crawling myself out of that hole, than paying all of that money to the government and then being left with nothing. So,
yeah.
And this goes back to what I said before of if you need to sell your catalog, don't sell your catalog.
Yeah. I like that. I like that philosophy. Yeah. Any future music that you write, can that be incorporated into the deal to sweeten it? Or are you better off holding those future songs close to your vest? Is that something that's even doable?
Yeah, I mean, there's you can skin the cat any way you want. I've seen this more in Nashville than anywhere else, where somebody will go to their existing publisher and sell their catalog, and they'll have a go forward in it. If it was me, I wouldn't do something like that, because really at the end of the day, they're sort of cross collateralizing the deal, right? And they're essentially paying for your acquisition with future earnings from your future copyrights. And if it were me, I would say, okay, everything prior to this date, I'm selling you. Everything going forward, I have an admin deal with Cobalt, and then let's revisit this in 5 years when I've written a bunch more hits. I would bet on myself to write more hits rather than try to squeeze every last dollar out of a deal when you could end up screwing yourself if you write the next biggest hit in the world and all of a sudden they've got your publishing and you sold it basically for another $1 million. It doesn't seem worth it to me.
So how do you go about making those decisions? Does that once again come back to that trusted financial advisor? Should you get a good entertainment attorney involved, accountants? Who is that close alliance of people you should have surrounding yourself to make all these decisions?
I usually advise, depending on who the artist's or writer's normal sort of day-to-day transactional attorney is, depending on their level of sophistication and experience, I'll often recommend that they get a sort of specialized music M&A attorney involved and, work out a deal that makes sense for everyone. Very often the business managers, a lot of them aren't even accountants to begin with. So making sure that you have a CPA who is giving you sound tax advice into the transaction. And one of the things that I've developed, it was a tool that already existed at my firm. It's called our wealth forecasting system. And I basically was able to tweak it to help answer the question for an artist as to whether or not they should sell. And what it does is it allows you to find the crossover point where if you invest the proceeds from your royalty streams versus invest the proceeds from the one-time liquidity event from the sale, I can show you with a pretty high degree of certainty where that crossover point happens, where the staying in your current royalty stream as it exists, or whether it's, with a 5% decay or a 5% uplift. I can show you how many years in the future it would take for that money invested to outperform the money invested from the one-time liquidity event proceeds. And, a lot of artists that I've worked with have found that incredibly helpful, because then they ask themselves the question of, well, could I have the discipline to invest all of my, mechanical and performance income every year for the next 15 years versus would I have the discipline to invest the proceeds from this one-time catalog sale today, leave it, and then make sure my sort of yearly expenses are covered by, other forms of revenue. So right. Finding that crossover point, I think, is really important.
So it's just surrounding yourself with the right people in the know that know what they're doing.
I would say having a person involved that is not getting paid a commission off your sale in your circle of advisors is really important.
Yeah, that's actually really good advice. Yeah.
Yeah.
How can people find you?
The Dan Weisman across social media. So Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, I'm an email away. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
The Business Side of Music is the creation of Tom Sabella and Tracy Snow and is produced by Bob Bender. The Business Side of Music is recorded at Music Dog Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. Production sound designed by Keith Stark. Voiceover and promo by Lisa Fuson.